My name is Andrew Quintman, and I'm an assistant professor of religious studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Yale University, and I work on the Buddhist traditions of Tibet and the Himalayas. We're here today in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. It is a place that has a very wonderful collection of Tibetan and Himalayan woodblock prints and manuscript texts, but they also have a really wonderful collection of portable Tibetan religious scroll paintings called thangkas. So we'll be looking at some of those paintings here today. Thangka is a Tibetan portable religious painting. It's a scroll painting, so it could be rolled up and easily transported. The subject matters are almost always religious in nature. Thangka painting could be commissioned by a High Lama for ritual purposes, or it could be commissioned by an ordinary family in the event of a death in the family for another kind of religious purpose. So painting, religious painting, was a great act of merit making in traditional Buddhist societies. Tibetan Thangka paintings vary greatly in terms of subject matter and style and iconography and the kinds of figures that they depict, but there are certain key elements that are common to almost all Tibetan Thangka paintings. So first, the central painting would be prepared on canvas. Canvas was usually white cotton that was framed in a stretcher. A kind of gesso was applied to it. Then the painter would usually lay out the iconometrics, so the kind of framework of grid lines and the outline of the central figures, the deities or the Buddha. Those lines would then be overlaid with paint or ink, so the outlining was done first, and then gradually the colors would be added, usually first the background and then the details of the figuring, and then finally the face would be done, the eyes, and the gild work. So most Thangka paintings actually have a kind of liquid gold that's applied to them. But once the painting was finished, that was really only the first part of the construction of a Thangka painting. The canvas would be taken off of its stretcher and then would be set within a complex brocade frame. So most thangkas, like this one, have an interior framework with several kinds of alternating colored brocades. And then that was set within a larger brocade frame. And then at the top and the bottom, they usually had wood bars that would help to stretch the thangka so that it would lay flat while hanging on the arm. And you can see on the bottom here, there are ornamental ends that were usually placed on the wooden bar. And then finally, there was a curtain that was attached to the top of the thangka that could be raised up when the thangka needed to be displayed, either for ritual ceremonies or even if it was just being left open in a shrine. But if the painting needed to be transported or protected in some way, then the curtain could be lowered, and that would protect the painting from the elements, from sunlight or dirt or dust or things like that. So Tibetan painting is generally rigidly defined. Traditional Tibetan painters had little leeway in terms of expressing their own kind of creativity. So what this means is that the detailed figures, the deities, the Buddha figures, had proportions that were clearly delineated within texts. And so one of the painter's first tasks would be to sort of translate the iconometrics that were transmitted in texts into visual form. And so every figure, including the figure of a Buddha that you see here, would have its proportions sort of rigidly laid out. And so a Tibetan painter would lay out a series of grid lines that would determine the proportion of the face to the body and the body torso to the overall figure. It would guide the painter in where to place the eyes or other important iconographic features of a Buddha, such as the cranial bump called the ujnisha on his head. There were also strict descriptions of the kinds of hand gestures called mudras, or the physical body postures or leg postures called asanas. These were also clearly laid out in texts. So once the iconometrics for the central figure was laid out and the secondary figures were laid out, then the painter had some flexibility in terms of how he laid out the background. And that could, in some instances, include kind of narrative stories like we see in this painting here, or it could include kind of environmental features, things like mountains or streams or sky and things like that. And that was really the realm in which the artist had great license to express his own creativity. So this painting was a gift to the Beinecke Library from Edna Breyer Schwab in 1967. And it was probably part of a set. We have at least one other painting that was part of this set. And the central figure is the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha. And the scenes around it describe a collection of his past lives called Jatakas. Now the Jatakas were a really important form of Buddhist literature. They are found in Buddhist traditions across Asia, in the Pali Canon, in the Tibetan and Chinese canons as well. There were hundreds of different Jataka stories, and there were several which were really important in Tibet, and this is one of those stories. So the central image here is the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, and he's shown in a kind of traditional form. He's seated cross-legged on a lotus throne. And the lotus is supported by a throne held up by 4 snow lions, a very traditional Tibetan motif. You'll see that he's seated with crossed legs, and his left hand is held in meditation posture. It holds a begging bowl. Here it looks like it's filled with flowers. And his right hand is held in the mudra of touching the earth, called the Bhumi Sparsha mudra. And this is a representation of the moment of the Buddha's enlightenment. And surrounding the central figure then is this great narrative from the story of the Buddha's previous life as Prince Vesantara. So the Jataka stories were a very important form of Buddhist literature that described the Buddha's past lives. They were often written in the form of morality tales, which describe a particular kind of virtue that the Buddha had to practice in a past life in order to eventually become the Buddha himself. And the Buddha, the Vesantara story then, was one of the most important of these Jataka stories in Tibet, where it was not only recorded in texts, but it was also performed in stage plays and was widely beloved across Tibet. This Thangka tells a Jataka story of the Buddha in a previous lifetime where he was reborn as a deer. So it's known as the Ruru Jataka story. The painting was given to the Beinecke Library by Edna Breyer Schwab in 1967 and forms part of a series with the Beinecke's painting of the Vesantara Jataka, also given by Edna Breyer Schwab. These 2 paintings depict the central figure in similar ways, although there are some interesting differences, but of course the narrative story being told in the background is very different. The central figure of this painting is the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, and he's seated, represented in the traditional way. He's wearing the robes of a monk. He's seated with his legs crossed in what's called the Vajra posture, with his feet on opposite thighs. His left hand is resting in his lap in the gesture of meditation, holding a begging bowl. And his right hand lightly touches the ground in the earth-touching gesture known as the Bhumi Sparsha mudra, which tells us that it's depicting the Buddha at the moment of his enlightenment. Now the Buddha sits on top of a lotus, and the lotus itself is supported by a throne which is held up by 4 mythical creatures called snow lions. The Buddha has a nimbus of light around him and a halo behind his head, and there's also this really wonderful floral motif surrounding the figure. The floral motifs of both of the paintings in this series, both this painting and the Vesantara painting, are similar, but they're slightly different, showing that there was some attention to creating a kind of difference in individual paintings. So these 2 paintings would have been part of a large series, perhaps more than a dozen paintings that would have been hung on a wall all at once, that together would represent the corpus of stories about the Buddha's previous lives. This Thangka represents a collection of deities from a very important ritual text known in the Tibetan as the Bardo Tudro, or the Liberation Through Hearing in the Intermediate State, which is better known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And it is a text that is traditionally read when someone is dying or shortly after his death. And the collection of deities, the ritual cycle of deities described in that text, are often commissioned as part of a painting when a person in the family dies as well. And that's what we see here. So this painting comes from Nepal. It was probably painted in the 1950s. And although it's not a very kind of high style painting, the execution is fairly provincial. It's a very interesting ethnographic example of how this kind of religious artwork was used in its ritual context. So the central figure in this painting is the tantric Buddha called Samantabhadra. He's blue in color, seated in the Vajra posture with his legs crossed, and holds in his lap his consort, and they're seated in sexual union. And surrounding them in these smaller roundels then are the 42 peaceful deities of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. At the top you have these various Tathagata Buddhas. On the lower register you have some of the protectors. But the most interesting part of this painting, from an ethnographic perspective, are in the bottom register. We see the Nepalese family that would have been the family who commissioned this painting. In the center, in the small kind of halo, kneeling with their hands in prayer, in the Anjali mudra, are perhaps the wife or the widow and the daughter of the person who had died, and surrounded perhaps by other male and female members of the extended family. We see the men and women both dressed in traditional Nepalese garb. You also see some figures who are smaller. These were likely children in the family. The men carry umbrellas. One of the women holds up a flower, perhaps as a kind of offering. And one very interesting feature of this painting is that the female figure who's in the center, whether or not this was by design on the part of the painter, has her feet which are literally sort of stepping out of the frame of the painting, which creates this great sense of liveliness. And you also see really interesting kind of pieces of how this painting would have been constructed. So in the lower left-hand corner, you see the outline of a dog, perhaps, you know, a family dog, which was done in outline but was never put into actual painting. So if we look at the back of the painting, then we see a further evidence of the ritual context in which a painting like this would have functioned. In many ways, the rear of the painting, which usually holds some kind of inscriptions, were as important, if not more important, than what was painted on the front side. So the first thing we notice is that each one of the central deities depicted on the front has on the back a series of ritual letters. These were Tibetan seed syllables, Om, Ah, and Hong. And these were inscribed on the back of the painting as a part of the consecration ritual, which would help to enliven the painting itself. It was a way of inviting the kind of numinous essence of the deities depicted on the front to reside within the painting, thereby activating it. Another interesting piece of the inscription on the back is this long string of Tibetan text written in a somewhat unskilled hand, but tells us the circumstances in which the painting was commissioned, who the family was, who the officiating lama was, and the date in which it was constructed. This is a very beautiful painting that was given to the Beinecke Library by an anonymous donor, a Yale graduate from the class of 1929. And it shows a collection of wrathful protector figures. These are protectors of the Dharma, of the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. Now in Tibetan Buddhism we have many kinds of iconography. We have figures of the Buddha, of the historical Buddha, of celestial Buddhas, of tantric Buddhas. We have other historical figures like great lamas of the past. And we have meditational deities that can be peaceful or wrathful. We have representations of great bodhisattvas. But in the Tibetan pantheon, we also have an important collection of protectors. And these were beings, some of which are believed to be enlightened, some of which are said to be just kind of mundane or ordinary worldly beings. But they have been sort of bound under oath to help protect the teachings of the Buddha within Tibet. And that's what we see here. And it's not one single protector, but a whole constellation of protectors that would have been important to a specific tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. The central figure of this painting is as of yet unidentified, but we know through inscriptional evidence on the reverse that it was aligned with a specific branch of Buddhist teachings from the Nyingma sect, or the ancient tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. The central figure bears resemblance to certain known protectors, although there are a number of interesting differences, so its identification is still open to interpretation. But we see that the central figure, blue in color, with 6 arms and 4 faces, surrounded in flames, standing on a lotus throne, and he's surrounded by a panoply of other figures, some of which can be identified, others have not yet been identified. But we can see that the execution of this painting is really very, very fine quality. The colors were created from traditional pigments, from ground minerals, or vegetable matter, or insect cocoons. And we also see very, very fine gold work, where gold is liquefied and then held onto the painting with glue, but you see very, very fine gold detail in the robes of the central figure and in the surrounding figures as well. When we look at the back of this painting, we see very interesting elements of its ritual consecration. So traditionally, when a Tibetan Thangka painting is completed, the painting itself is considered to be really a kind of receptacle, an empty shell, a mere representation of the figures on the front. And it's only once the consecration ritual is completed that the figures on the front are ritualistically brought to life. So one of the most important elements of that kind of consecration is the inscription of seed syllables. So we see on parts of the main figure's body. So here we see a collection of the seed syllables that would have been placed in various parts of the central figure's body, and those then become points in which the body, speech, and mind, qualities and activities of the numinous essence of that deity to come down and actually reside within the painting itself, at which point the painting becomes activated so that the painting is no longer a mere representation of the deity, but in fact is the actual manifestation of that deity itself, empowered to act just as that deity would. Another interesting feature of the consecration that we see on the back of the painting are these 2 sets of red handprints that would likely have been placed by the ritual lama himself as a means of imparting some of his own power into the painting. We see one very clear set of handprints at the top and a slightly lighter set of handprints at the bottom. We have no way of knowing whether they were handprints of the same person or not. But one of the interesting features of the first set of handprints are the 2 thumbs on the right hand. This story is known as the Jataka of the starving tigress, and it's an account wherein in one of his previous lives the Buddha was born as a prince, where as he sets out on a hunting party comes across a tigress and her starving cubs, and through an act of great generosity and self-sacrifice offers his own flesh and blood to the tigress so that she might be able to feed her own cubs. And so, like many Jatakas, it's a morality tale that teaches about the necessity for the practice of compassion and self-sacrifice on the path to Buddhahood. This story was much loved by Tibetans who knew the account, and traditionally the story is said to have taken place at a location near the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal, where it's popularly known as Namo Buddha, but the Tibetans call it Tagmo Lujin, the place where the prince offered his body to the tigress. So on the rear of the painting, we don't see much in terms of inscriptional evidence, but there is one small inscription which tells us that this painting, like most Jataka paintings, were part of a larger series. And in fact, those series would need to be arranged in a very specific order, and they were usually carefully marked. Each painting was carefully marked on the back so that we would know which in the series it would come. So here, this painting is marked as the 3rd on the left. In 1950, the Yale alumnus Elliot Beecher McCrae traveled to India and then eventually on to Sikkim, where he met the Maharaja Chogyal, or the Dharma King, Tashi Namgyal, who offered McCrae this lovely Thangka of Manjushri, which his family then later donated to the Beinecke Library. The figures in the painting were reportedly modeled after McCrae's own family, who had accompanied him on his trip to Sikkim. Soon after his return, McCrae became president of the publishing giant E.P. Dutton, where he arranged for the release of several climbing tales, including W.H. Murray's The Story of Everest and the Mount Everest Reconnaissance Expedition by Eric Shipton. But among McCrae's greatest publishing successes was Austrian climber Heinrich Herrer's memoir, 7 Years in Tibet. The central figure in this painting is Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, often described as the emanation of the Buddha's own wisdom. And he's depicted here in his traditional iconographic form. In his right hand he holds a blazing sword, and this is the sword of wisdom that cuts through ignorance. And in his left hand, held in the gesture of teaching near his heart, he holds the stem of a lotus, which rises up above his shoulder, and on top of that lotus is a traditional Tibetan religious text. And the text is of the Prajna Paramita Sutras, or the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, also showing Manjushri's embodiment of wisdom.